Okay, so I'm doing a little postscript here, a little addendum to chapter 8. I went back and looked at the videos that I posted, and there was actually two things that I kind of forgot to cover and forgot to mention. So we're going to cover them now. So in reference to negative externalities. All right, so if you go back and look at the video on negative externalities, we talked about them, we defined them, and we talked about the government's response to them, right? So how does the government correct for negative externalities? We talked about policies, and we talked about regulation, and then we talked about that Pigovian tax, right? And those are all government responses. But it turns out that sometimes the government doesn't need to get involved, right? So there's something called the Coase Theorem. Let's see if I spelled that right. Theorem. Yes. So the Coase Theorem. And the Coase Theorem states it's basically the proposition that if property rights are well defined and the cost is sufficiently low or within reason, then the government doesn't always have to get involved to correct for negative externalities. And sort of, kind of a simple example of this is, let's say it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you hear dog barking, right? So your neighbor's dog is barking, and that would be an example of a negative externality. So how do you correct for that? I mean, you don't have to call the cops. You don't have to get the government involved. You can simply pick up a phone and call your neighbor and say, hey, your dog's barking. Is there something you can do about that? And again, the assumption is that the cost structure is within reason. The private sector can solve for negative externalities. And so Coase theorem, probably worth knowing. And there you go. All right. That was number 1. Number 2, I'm back to not having an eraser, so I'm using my hand, are sort of the functions or roles of the government. And this is sort of an interesting topic, right? Because right now there's a lot of discussion, a lot of things going on in terms of, what role should the government play in society, and what exactly belongs to the government in terms of responsibility, etc. But as a minimum, what we're going to I'm going to list out 6 things here, okay? So the first is promoting macro goals. Now, this series of videos is microeconomics, so we're focusing our attention on the decisions of households and firms. But if you look at the other series of videos in terms of macro, you'll quickly learn that the 3 macro goals of every economic system are price stability, full employment, and economic growth, right? And so those are measured. Price stability, that's measured by the inflation rate. Full employment, that's measured by the inflation rate. And then economic growth is measured by GDP. And all of those are part of the government's responsibility and function to monitor and do everything it can to achieve those goals. So we'll just leave it at that, again, since this is a micro course. Number 2, is a legal framework. So one of the most important functions of government is to provide a legal framework, especially when it comes to property rights. Well-defined legal framework in terms of who owns property and who has control of those. Because again, when the private sector, households and firms are the ones that control the vast majority of the property, then it's vital to have that well established. A quick example of what happens when that's not well established: you can take a country like Russia, who up until 1917, a lot of property was in the hands of different families, and could be traced back to generations and generations. And then in the 1917 revolution, the state seized that private property and then held on to it for close to 70, 75 years, right? So with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, now, again, Russia and some of the old Soviet bloc countries have struggled a little bit with property rights in terms of like, okay, so if I want to buy that house right there, who do I buy it from? Do I buy it from the state? Do I buy it from, the state seized it from a family, a couple of generations ago, so do they still have a legal claim on that property? Do I have to buy it through them? So again, it's not as clear, and it makes it difficult when you don't have well-established legal framework in terms of property rights. So big, huge, important part of what the government does. Poverty. The government functions, one of the government functions, one of the roles of the government is to deal with poverty. So poverty has always been a problem for every society since the beginning of time. And the way in which the government handles that and addresses that is important, okay? A fourth role for the government is correcting for externalities. We just talked about externalities in this past series of videos, and both positive externalities and negative externalities, right? So the government, one of the roles of governments is to correct for negative externalities, and we talked about that and how they do it and some of the tools they have. As I just said, there's regulation, there's policies, there's taxes, but the government also corrects for positive externalities, right? So there's subsidies that the government provides for arts and humanities and things like, opera and local theater and things like that. So big responsibility of the government. A fifth is providing for public goods. And again, if you went back and listened to some of the earlier videos in this series, we talked about public goods. We talked about how largely public goods are goods that are not provided by the private market. So, I think the example I used earlier was a park, a free park. There's no company in the world that's going to buy land and then, just open up a free park because there's no business case for that. And so the government gets involved and then provides for public goods. And the sixth and final one that I want to just highlight is promoting competition. In a market-driven society, competition is good. Competition is what keeps prices down. Competition is sort of at the center of a free market system. And the government gets really interested when competition is diminished. So in a later series of videos, we'll talk about two market structures, oligopolies and monopolies. And those are two times when the government starts taking an interest. And a good example is you can read in the news about mergers. So mergers and acquisitions. There are certain industries like the airline industry, the auto industry, the telecommunications industry, where there are so few firms now that control so much of the market that the term's antitrust. The government gets involved and looks at competition and antitrust issues and makes a determination if two companies can merge and get together, or if that will provide not enough competition and reduce the effectiveness in the market. So those are sort of that's kind of a high level look at some of the roles of government. Notice what's not on there. What's not on there is making sure that everybody in society has everything equally. In fact, equality is something that isn't or hasn't traditionally been part of the government's role. So there's a lot of things that aren't on the list that are being discussed now in terms of healthcare and other things like that. But as a minimum, this is sort of the functions of the government. Okay, so there's my addendum, And we are now through with chapter 8.